Hello everyone, welcome to week 5 of EDST 536, Economic Rationalization of Canadian Higher Education. So some orienting questions for this week. What are the different elements related to the economic rationalization of Canadian higher education over the past 40 to 50 years? What are the different responses to economic rationalization? And how does economic rationalization relate to other issues discussed in this course? So, over the past few decades, higher education around the globe has undergone considerable changes that I've broadly grouped under the umbrella of economic rationalization. But you can also hear many related terms, some of which I'll discuss today, including neoliberalization, privatization, marketization, corporatization, commercialization, commodification, financialization, academic capitalism, and even enclosure of the academic commons. So these terms don't mean the same thing, and they have a general pattern, but they look quite different depending on when and where they appear. But nonetheless, Brian Puser suggests there's a rare degree of consensus in the scholarly community on the power of market ideology in shaping contemporary politics and practice of higher education. According to Dodds, the extension of market-based services to govern formerly public services, including higher education, has become common throughout the globe, and especially in the global north, in a place like Canada, we see this shift from the liberal welfare state university model, which dominated in the post-World War II era, to the now post-welfare state university model. So according to John Williams, who's a critical university studies scholar, the welfare state held a substantial role in redistribution, whereas the post-welfare state holds a lesser role in redistribution and a more substantial role in private accumulation. So many people have identified that there's this declining or at least shifting public role of higher education, and they have done this from various theoretical and political perspectives. So some people embrace this, other people say, well, we need to at least compromise. Some people say we need to radically resist, and others say, you know what, it's not great, but there's probably not a lot we can do about it. So regardless of where you stand on this, there's two kind of orienting questions in a lot of this research that Siebold has identified. How do we conceptualize what is happening to higher education, and how do we resist its increasing corporatization? So we're going to talk a bit about this in the lecture today. And following Posesnik's notion that dialogue about neoliberalism and the university is a discursive battle over what higher education is or should be, we can see the current moment as a difficult moment that nonetheless might offer opportunities to rethink and reimagine the future of our institutions. But as always, how we analyze the present and relate it to the past will shape how we propose possible futures. So I'm going to try to address the broad trends of economic rationalization and consider some of the available responses to it, and also link it back to other conversations in the course. So in addition to all the frameworks I mentioned before, like neoliberalism, economic rationalization, marketization, we can talk about the new economy itself and what this actually looks like. So I'm drawing from Tressie McMillan Cotton, who wrote a book called Lower Ed about private for-profit universities in the US. It's a great book. There aren't really many for-profit universities in Canada, but I think there's a lot to be gained from reading across borders in this way. So one of the things that Dr. McMillan Cotton notes is that the new economy makes one overriding demand of education: constantly and consistently retrain millions of workers quickly and at little to no expense for the employer. Whereas in the post-war era, generally speaking, employers did invest more money in training their own workers because they knew that they would be there for a long time, perhaps throughout their whole career, whereas that has shifted today. So she identifies 4 particular shifts. The first is that people are frequently changing their jobs and their employers over their lifetime, so there's job mobility. Firms are placing greater reliance on contract, term, and temporary labor. So not only do people shift jobs, but firms themselves don't want to hire people permanently because then they take on the responsibility for that person. They need to pay their insurance premiums, for instance, and they need to commit to them in the long term. So as a result then of the first two things, there's less reliance on employers for income growth and career progression. You can't, generally speaking, stay within the same company for your whole life, because you won't be able to move up in the ranks of that company. You'd have to go to a different company, first of all, but also to potentially increasingly amplify your own education. So it's whereas once it was sort of becoming the norm that everyone had a bachelor's, now it's more common that in order to move up in a position, you need to at least have a master's. And at some point, it might be the case that that's what it is for a doctorate. So there's sort of this idea that you have to be the one to improve your skill constantly and grow in your job. It's not the employer that's going to support you to do that. And then finally, workers are shouldering more responsibility for job training, healthcare, and retirement. So all of these things points to the fact that there's actually more and more of a role for higher education institutions, not only in preparing people to enter the workforce, but in continually what they would call upskilling people to advance in their careers, because if they don't get more and more education themselves, then their employer is not necessarily going to provide that training. At the same time, however, what we're going to see in a moment is that the context of neoliberalism has meant that there's actually fewer and fewer public resources to support people to receive their initial education and to continue that education. So you've probably heard the term neoliberalism by now. Maybe you even know it well from your courses. I'll try to summarize it here, but there's always a lot more to say than we probably have time for. A pretty basic definition comes from Wendy Brown, who describes neoliberalism as a radically free market, maximized competition and free trade, economic deregulation, elimination of tariffs and taxes, social policies favorable to businesses and indifferent toward poverty, social deracination, cultural decimation, and long-term resource depletion and environmental destruction. In addition to all this, she points to the fact that neoliberalism has really extended market logics to all realms of life, whereas, of course, it was always this way in economic realms of life, since the dawn of capitalism in any case. There are certain parts of social and political life that were fairly walled off from this economic imperative in her analysis. And increasingly, the economic rationale has come into that realm as well. And neoliberalism itself sort of emerged in terms of the ideas behind it in the post-war era, but it didn't really become mainstream until the 1970s. And what people generally say is that it's not entirely new, hence the neoliberalism, but it's essentially a reworking of established tenets of liberal philosophy and classical economics. So its origins can really be traced back for centuries. But it was really by the 1970s that it became this primary organizing logic for both public and private life, and especially the retrenchment of public services and funding from what it had been in the post-World War II era, including funding for education. And what's important to note, too, is that some people frame neoliberalism as the decline or the shrinking of the state. But others say that it's actually really more of a reshifting of boundaries and priorities and responsibilities. So, for instance, geographer Jamie Peck, who's a faculty member at UBC, points out that neoliberalism isn't a simple process of replacing states with markets, because you always need some power to manage and police the states. And because markets and the general economic infrastructure always requires some other force. So for instance, even the protection of private property, which is central to neoliberalism, needs, for instance, a police force to protect that property. So it's not that the state goes away, it just reframes its responsibilities. And in fact, in many cases, it has increased its spending on things like policing. So there's a really interesting graph of the state of California that at the very same time that funding for public universities was declining, you can see the spending on policing and prisons go up. And the numbers actually, kind of merge at one point. So although it's never this direct shift of spending from one to the other, it appears that the priorities really shifted. The other thing about neoliberalism is that it frames individuals as rational economic actors who are basically entrepreneurs of themselves. They are deciding where to invest their time and money, and they will make the most efficient decisions, whereas previously it was shared responsibility with the state. So there's really this huge emphasis on choice, and choice being the maximum freedom. But what critics point out is that choice doesn't mean much if you don't have the resources. So in the conversation, for instance, in the US about public healthcare, when conversations shift to why don't we have more public funding like a place like Canada, people say, well, if we did that, we would lose the choice to, for instance, pick our own doctor. But what critics then respond is, it doesn't matter if I can pick a doctor if I can't pay for them. And we could say similar things for higher education. Yes, theoretically, people can choose to go to any school they want, assuming they can get in, but whether they can afford it or not is a very different question. So neoliberalism in higher education. There's a piece by Malcolm Tite that summarizes a lot of these discussions. I think I would quibble with a lot of the ways he frames things, but I think as an overview it's very useful. And he really notes that at this point it's really hard to talk about higher education policy or practice without also thinking about the role of neoliberalism. And people describe it as a means of kind of understanding the background context for policies and practices, or describing or diagnosing what's going wrong. It's rarely used in a positive way. Not only that, but people who are probably the ones really enacting what would be called neoliberal policies don't frame themselves as neoliberalism. This is not a term that people would use, certainly not use proudly. They would simply say, I'm making, the economically rational choice, for instance. And Tite actually says that neoliberalism has been especially strong in its impacts in education, and higher education specifically, particularly because it's a huge contrast between what was there before, especially in the post-war era, and the present. So I'm going to briefly describe different dimensions of the impact of economic rationalization or neoliberalization in higher education, and I break it up between marketization and privatization. And again, these overlap. It's not a clean split, but I think analytically it's useful to keep them a bit separate, at least for now. So first is the use of business logics to manage faculty and other laborers within the university. The general notion, if we apply neoliberal rationality, is that if a faculty's teaching or research is worthwhile, the market will tell us. So more students will enroll in their courses if it's about teaching, and if it comes to research funding, they will be the ones who get funding. And beyond that, their research will actually produce economic outcomes by creating new intellectual property, for instance. So rather than in the post-war era when faculty's scholarship was expected to serve the public good, but not necessarily in economic ways, now the economic imperative is much stronger. And this has resulted in people's analysis in faculty being less autonomous in their work and having weaker positions in university governance. And people even say that faculty have become deprofessionalized. They aren't given that kind of autonomy that they were, even in the areas that were perceived to be their specializations, like creating curriculum. Generally speaking, yes, we still have the ability to create our own curriculum, but there's more external eyes on it. There's more people kind of asking, well, is this an economically smart investment for us to create this course in a way that wasn't there previously? Now, what some people point out is that in many ways, what's happening is that faculty are losing their exceptionalism as workers, especially in the university, because they had, or we have, certain benefits that other workers, even within the university itself, don't have. So people are asking, well, is the point of resisting marketization for faculty to just get back those exceptional entitlements, or is it to fight for everyone to have more professional autonomy? So the question is, do we fight just for our own group, or do we ask, well, what do the custodial staff need? What do the clerical staff need? And bringing those conversations and those experiences together. Then there's academic capitalism, which you have learned about from the Metcalf article, but essentially the idea is that universities are encouraged to become centers for capital accumulation through commercializing research, through creating technology and intellectual property. And there's, generally speaking, this boundary between the academy and industry is broken down a bit. Of course, there was never a total distinction between the two. Even during the post-war era, these relationships were there. But what has really happened is that whereas the relationships before were less direct, now it's more direct. That institutions and universities don't just make new discoveries that then might become monetized. They're expected to create the discoveries that are immediately monetizable. Then students as customers. Like faculty or like others, students in the neoliberal era are expected to act as rational economic actors. They're expected to, for instance, when they're choosing an institution, do the research and decide what is going to be the best investment of my time and money. And students are expected to increasingly use their own monies, and you might get that money from grants, but often it's in the form of loans. So they're taking on more and more of the responsibility. And then institutions are trying to attract and retain those students. And some critique that in that process, they're spending money on things that aren't really about improving the education per se, but that are improving the general experience with flashy investments that don't really serve the educational purpose of the university. Others also point out that if you treat students as customers, when faculty raise difficult issues or challenge students to think more deeply, especially on things like, for instance, race, students feel more empowered to push back and resist that because they say, well, you know what, I've paid for this experience. This isn't very pleasant. I don't want to talk about that thing. And while that kind of extreme response doesn't happen often, there is a lot more pushback, according to some research. So how are we going to address that shift? But if you make students pay for their own education, then it seems only natural that they would take on that position of a consumer and a customer. And in business, the motto is the customer is always right. And does that work in higher education? And then finally, the role of the university in the knowledge economy. So people say that not only does the university increasingly resemble a private corporation itself, but it really is integrated into the economy and supporting its reproduction. So this would be primarily by training students to be workers in that economy and also producing innovations and research that supports the growth of that economy. So then privatization. We talk about the public good. So scholars of higher education really argue for the need to reimagine the role of higher education in the public good. People say that since at least the Enlightenment era, higher education has played a central role in public life, although this role has shifted over time. And of course, even at that time, higher education also supported private benefits at the same time, but especially with the emphasis on public funding in the post-war era, there was then in turn an emphasis on public good or public benefits. So then you get into the nitty-gritty of like, what does the public good mean? Who decides? Who is the public? But nonetheless, there's a general consensus that higher education has increasingly moved away from serving the public good and towards serving private interests more exclusively. Then you have this privatization of knowledge and the narrowing of knowledge for economic purposes. As I noted in the marketization discussion, increasingly the knowledge produced by universities, it's increasingly measured by the extent to which it produces economic value. And even if something serves the public good, if it doesn't serve the economic good, then it might not be valued by the institution or by funders. And then the shifting role of the state, which I mentioned in general in relation to neoliberalism. You see probably one of the most blatant roles is that there's less public funding for higher education. And this generally means that picking up the slack are students through their tuition. And this is students in general, but as we saw last week in terms of internationalization, particularly looking for students who are paying higher fees to make up for the declining public funds. So all of these kind of themes from our weeks are sort of coming together now under the theme of economic rationalization. Which is why I was kind of torn, like, should I put it at the beginning of the course because it kind of informs everything, or put it at the back end where we can draw all the things we've learned previously and see how they connect. So that's what I've done this year. I'll be interested to hear your feedback as to whether it would have been more useful at the beginning. So these are the general critiques of economic rationalization, and what I want to do is sort of, as always, tease out the different perspectives within these general critiques. So again, different analyses of the past and the present then shape how we look at the future. So as you saw in the Boggs and Mitchell piece, there's this critique of the way that many responses to the neoliberal present tend to romanticize the past and the public university in general. And they say what often happens when we do that is we forget the way that previous public university was subsidized through dispossession, which we talked about in our unit on foundations. So how do the stories that we tell about the foundations and histories of higher education shape how we diagnose the problems of the present and propose different futures? It's very, very common, as they note, for when we're critiquing the neoliberal present, for us to look back, especially at the post-World War II era, and say, wasn't it great? Wouldn't it be preferable to go back to those funding models? But what they're pointing out is that the funding that came in that era wasn't free money. It was tied to things like militarism in the US, for instance, because of the Cold War. And they're really asking us to say, is it possible to critique what we have in the present without romanticizing what we had in the past so that we don't create the same problems? The other thing to consider, there's a historian of higher education, David Labery, and he really says, if you look back at the whole history of higher education, he's looking at the US, the post-World War II era was really the exception rather than the rule. So we never saw anything like it, and he says we'll probably never see anything like it again. So we should stop trying to return to that moment and ask how we move forward given the circumstances we find ourselves in. So if we place the economically rationalized present of Canadian higher education in a history that starts with colonization of Indigenous lands, rather than with the post-World War II era, how might our diagnosis of and propositions for the present change? How could we imagine an alternative to what we have in the present, assuming we have a critique of it, which not everyone might, that doesn't reproduce the same kind of colonial relations that we had in the past? And it's you might be surprised how difficult it is for people to hold all of these things together, to hold the tension of the fact that there were problems with the previous public university, even as we might be trying to have a different kind of public university that we have now. It's really hard to imagine some future that's not the present nor what we had in the past. And that's, I think the beyond reform approach is generally that space of unintelligibility or what is unimaginable. And it asks us to go beyond probably what we can really imagine. So I invite you to think a bit, and maybe even your questions might be related to this, to ask, how does economic rationalization relate to indigenization and decolonization? How does it relate to internationalization? And how might it relate to COVID-19 in terms of what has happened so far and what might be happening in the next few months and years? So I think there's relationships between all of these things, and it's up to us to make the connections, because too often we are in these sort of siloed conversations. Oh, I write about marketization of higher education. I don't know anything about indigenization, or vice versa. And I think we're missing a lot if we're not thinking about how these things might be connected. So let's go back to Tite. He asks, why is neoliberalism so present in and influential on higher education? And he gives a few reasons. One, it's still prevalent and influential because it's prevalent and influential everywhere. And higher education doesn't stand in a vacuum. It's very much embedded within these larger political, social, and economic structures and policies. So of course it would be affected by neoliberalism. It's not exceptional and this thing that stands apart from society. The other reason he gives is that neoliberalism is broadly accepted by those who are responsible for higher education policy and management. It appears to be the only option for how to run our universities, and in particular, the only option because people sense that if you don't go in that direction, your institution might no longer be viable, especially if everyone else is doing it. If you're not competing and keeping up, then you might have a huge economic gap in your budget, for instance. So what are the alternatives for those academics who don't, well, not just academics, students, staff, who don't buy into neoliberalism? So he gives a couple options. One is despair and say, I don't know what to do, I'm overwhelmed. And then he says, well, this isn't likely to get anyone anywhere, but it's certainly an option. Another one is resistance. And he says, well, this may allow individuals or small groups or even whole departments to work around or play with policies and practices, but if they don't meet the general standards of graduation, of publication, of grants, they're probably going to have a problem in the long term, and it's not going to change the overall picture. And then he says privatization. Some institutions actually say, you know what, we would rather just basically become private institutions because then at least we wouldn't have to deal with the government's national standards. This isn't a huge thing in Canada, of course, although some people are basically suggesting that even public institutions like UBC are essentially becoming private institutions. So he kind of paints a fairly bleak picture. And he asks, as an open question, is there another practical strategy short of going along with neoliberalism and its associated policies, or hanging on the hope that ideology and policy will eventually change? And I think, it's a question for us to ask. And it may be partially answered depending on what happens in the wake of COVID, in the wake of climate change. But I think, especially when it comes to the neoliberal rules of the game in our institutions, what I've generally encouraged my students, like my advisees, is that you need to learn what the rules of the game are. And then once you learn the rules, you can decide, do you want to play the game? Do you want to subvert the game? Or do you not want to play the game at all? But I think it's important to be informed about how the game works and then decide what you want to do. And a lot of people try to do a bit of both. They try to play the game to hold the space for what's possible, and they say, at the long term, this isn't a good game, it's a very harmful game, and we might need something else. So how do we both play the game enough to keep ourselves there, but also work toward a different future? This is one thing that I've seen happen. So I just want to conclude by offering a kind of another cartography of what minor, major, beyond, and no reform responses to economic rationalization are. I'm not going to go over this in detail. I'll always, as usual, upload the slides. But I did want to point out a couple things. So one is that I've tried to link the different reforms with the different ways of studying higher education that I mentioned in my first lecture. So the minor reform approach is generally the one that dominates in higher education studies, which is most of the work that we've been looking at in this course is from higher education studies, although not exclusively. So there's definitely a critique of economic rationalization and a critique of the declining, for instance, public funding is a huge one, but there's also this romanticism about the post-World War II eras and a huge emphasis on the public good. And one of my questions is always, again, well, who is the public? Who decides what's good, and these kinds of things? But this is a huge emphasis for higher education studies. Then the major reform is generally one reflected in critical university studies, which says, you know what, the balance of power, like with the minor reform critique, really is too much favoring the capitalist market. And we really need to shift that. So either decenter the market, or even dismantle it, which is different from the minor reform that says, you know what, we need to have a better balance. It's not saying generally that we don't want the capitalist market, it's just it needs to have a bit of balance between that and the public good. So then you have the beyond reform, which really is more aligned with what maybe we would say abolitionist university studies is looking at. And it's not only that, things are out of balance in terms of the state and capitalism, but that the state, capitalist markets, and academics themselves and students are all complicit in this underlying set of colonial relations. And yes, they're unevenly affected by things like neoliberalism, but if we don't address these underlying colonial relations, no matter what kind of future we imagine, we're still going to be reproducing them. And whether it's liberalism or neoliberalism, that doesn't change. So these are quite different approaches, actually, to economic rationalization and quite different diagnoses of the problem. And then, of course, the orienting questions that they have reflect that. So, for instance, for the minor reform, it's, well, how can we ensure more people understand the public good purpose of higher education? How can we allocate public resources more efficiently? Whereas for major reform, it's, how can we ensure students have more power in university governance and finance? So they're not just customers, but they actually have an active role in their education. How can we ensure that those who need resources the most receive them, especially those who are the most marginalized? And then the beyond reform isn't really offering prescriptions, but it's asking, why is it so hard to imagine higher education without the colonial nation state and without capitalism? How are universities sustained through racialized expropriation and exploitation? And again, not just in the neoliberal present, but also in the liberal post-war era and the eras that preceded that. So I hope this cartography is useful, and that the lecture was helpful for bringing together a lot of the different themes of the course. As always, I really look forward to our discussions together. As a reminder, there's no paper this week. I want you to focus on your final projects. So I will see you on Wednesday.